Hello, I'm Liz Anders. I'm the chair of Always United this year, and I'm happy to have you back for another Tuesday talk. I think you'll find this one very interesting. We have two very good sites, an opportunity for volunteering in a cause that has a really big need. I want to point out to you that our sponsor's name is up in the corner above my head. AARP Driver Safety, and we appreciate very much their sponsoring Always United this year, as they have in the past. If you're an Always United member, please let us know you're here. There's a place on the screen where you can comment, tell us your name. And if you're not a member, we'd like to know you're here too and hope that you will join us one day. Now, I would like to introduce to you the moderator for this presentation, Claudia Brooks. Claudia used to be a staff member at United Way, and now she's the activities chair of Always United. She's having so much fun with us, she couldn't leave. Claudia?
I could not leave, and I am so happy to be able to present our speakers today and to let you know that our program today comes from a request by our members to talk about the kind of volunteer work that we can do. It's not just the one-off that a lot of times you're able to do, like go help to pack things or paint buildings or rooms or that kind of thing, but something that you could sink your teeth into. And we're really glad to have Brenda Stalzer, who's the director of the South Carolina Vulnerable Adult Guardian Ad Litem Program at the South Carolina Department on Aging. She's been with the program since 2013 and is responsible for managing the program, recruiting and training volunteers, assigning cases, and working with the program's contract attorneys. Brenda is a licensed social worker and received her master's degree from Adelphi University in New York prior to working with the Guardian Ad Litem Program. Brenda worked for the Protection and Advocacy for People with Disabilities, Inc., where she conducted inspections of residential care facilities and served as an advocate for the people with traumatic brain injuries and related disabilities. Brenda, it sure sounds like you've got a lot of qualifications to make sure that our vulnerable adults here in South Carolina are taken care of. And she's also joined by Phil Waddell. We know Phil well here. He spent 37 years with the corporate world as a UPS executive, and he's been very active with United Way as a volunteer and a donor since the 1980s. He retired in 2007 and stayed real busy with his own companies in the Columbia area. But he's also stayed very busy by volunteering not with just with United Way programs, but also with the Guardian Ad Litem program. So we're really happy to be able to hear his story today too. So Brenda, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I just want to start by thanking Liz, Claudia, Adina, and all of you at at Always United for having us here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn about our program and what we do. And hopefully some of you will choose to become volunteers. Phil, we're just thrilled to have you here with us today. I know most everyone on this who's watching this video knows you already, but they might not know that you've been just a wonderful volunteer for us. You've been with us for a little over a year now and have had some really challenging cases. So we're just thrilled to have you, thankful for everything you do for us every day, and especially for being here today.
Well, thank you. Appreciate those kind words.
Yeah. Okay, so throughout this presentation, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk more about the technical aspects of the program, and Phil's going to talk to you about what it's like to be a volunteer. Our objectives for today are to learn a little bit about the South Carolina Department on Aging and the VAGAL SC program. Let me just touch base on the VAGAL SC. That's an acronym you're going to see a lot. That stands for Vulnerable Adult Guardian Ad Litem of South Carolina program. Another acronym that you're going to see a lot today and hear a lot today is GAL. GAL stands for Guardian Ad Litem. Our next objective is to understand what happens when adults are taken into custody. We're going to review some case examples, and Phil's going to discuss what it's like to be a volunteer. Next slide. Okay, the South Carolina Department on Aging is a state cabinet agency. It's probably the newest cabinet agency, or one of the newest ones. And we work with a network of regional and local organizations to develop and manage services that help seniors remain independent in their homes and communities. Some of these services are the South Carolina Ombudsman Program. In the Ombudsman Program, they go out and do investigations of abuse and neglect in nursing facilities, assisted living facilities, and other facilities that serve people with disabilities. We also have the Senior Pet Program, which helps seniors keep pets at home care services, transportation, information referral. We have a great website called getcaresc.com. And if you need a service, or somebody you know needs a service, you can enter your zip code, enter the service you need, and it will provide you with a list of providers that can provide that service for you. We also offer family caregiver support, group dining, and home delivered meals. And as you can imagine, home delivered meals have been very important lately with the pandemic and everyone staying at home. A couple of things to note about the Department on Aging. Most of our programs are federally funded through the Older Americans Act. Also, there's no means test for our program, so you don't have to be below a certain income limit in order to qualify, which differentiates us from a lot of other programs. So this is great for people that might be middle class and normally can afford meet their expenses on their own, but they have an extra challenge and they need a little extra help. So that's an important thing to know. Next slide. The Vulnerable Adult Guardian Ad Litem program is a little different than some of the other programs because we're completely state funded. We don't get any federal funding. We began as a pilot project at USC's Arnold School of Public Health in 2010. In May of 2014, enabling legislation was signed into law by Governor Nikki Haley, which established the VAGAL SC program. At that time, VAGAL SC became part of what is now the South Carolina Department on Aging. And the Omnibus Adult Protection Act is the legislation that governs VAGAL SC. And next slide. The mission of VAGAL SC is to advocate for the best interests of abused, neglected, and exploited vulnerable adults in cases brought before the South Carolina Family Courts by providing quality adult guardian ad litem representation. Who is a vulnerable adult guardian ad litem? That's an individual appointed to represent the best interests of a vulnerable adult for the purpose of a legal procedure in family court. The adults that we serve are under the custody of the South Carolina Department of Social Services. Next slide. How do you define a vulnerable adult? So in South Carolina, according to South Carolina law, a vulnerable adult is a person 18 years or older who has a physical or mental condition which substantially impairs that person from adequately providing for his or her own care or protection. A key thing to note here is it's a physical or mental condition. So somebody may be cognitively intact and able to make their own decisions, but if they have a physical condition which impairs their ability to provide for their own care or protection, they can still be considered vulnerable under South Carolina law. Next slide. When can an adult be taken into custody by the South Carolina Department of Social Services? So a lot of people don't even know that adults can be taken into custody, but in South Carolina they can. And there are 3 criteria that must be met. First, the person must meet the definition of a vulnerable adult under the Omnibus Adult Protection Act. And that's the definition that we just went over. Second, the person must be at substantial risk of being neglected, abused, or exploited due to their vulnerable adult status. 3, protective services must be necessary to protect the adult. In other words, adult protective services needs to be involved in order to protect this adult and keep the adult safe. Next slide. How are adults brought into custody of the South Carolina Department of Social Services? There are 2 ways that adults can be brought into custody. The most common way is known as emergency protective custody. That's when law enforcement places the vulnerable adult into custody when there is probable cause of imminent danger. An example of this would be, let's say you have a neighbor who has some dementia, normally she's able to take care of herself. You see her out and about and she does okay. But suddenly you realize you haven't seen her in a while. It's been 4 or 5 days she hasn't come out of her house. You call law enforcement. Law enforcement goes to her home. They get into her home. They find her laying in bed. Maybe she's soiled. They look at her medications. They're expired. They check her food. Her food is rotten, or there's not a lot of food. And then they talk to her. And it's obvious when they talk to her that she's very confused. At that point, law enforcement might decide to take your neighbor into emergency protective custody. The second way that adults can be taken into custody, this is a little less common, is by ex parte order. And that's when Adult Protective Services petitions family court for an order for protective services. This might be when Department of Social Services already has an open case. They're working with somebody. It's not a legal case. They're not under custody, but they've been helping this person out, and the person's condition worsens. Adult Protective Services feels like the person needs more help. Maybe the person isn't willing to accept that help. So then they can go to the court. Department of Social Services can approach the court and ask the judge for permission to take the adult into custody, and that's called ex parte. Next slide. From a legal perspective, what happens next? So family court must appoint a guardian ad litem and an attorney for the vulnerable adult within 10 days of filing the petition. So within 10 days of that legal case opening, a guardian ad litem and an attorney have to be appointed for the adult. While that adult is in custody, the guardian ad litem represents the adult's best interest. They also serve as an advocate for the adult throughout the process. The vulnerable adult's attorney represents what the adult wants. It doesn't matter if this is in the adult's best interest or not, it's what the adult wants. So if your neighbor says, no, I want to go home, I'm fine, I can do fine, even if that might not make sense to anyone else, if that's what your neighbor wants, that's what their attorney would represent. Next slide. So what happens to the adult themselves when they're taken into custody? The vulnerable adult will typically be sent to the hospital for medical evaluation. That's usually the first stop. While they're in the hospital, DSS will work with the nursing home social worker to search for appropriate, safe, and suitable placement for the adult. Once the adult is medically cleared for discharge, vulnerable adults are usually placed while they're in custody in a nursing facility or community residential care facilities. Community residential care facilities are also more commonly known as assisted living facilities. They can also be placed in a motel with paid caregivers. So DSS will get a motel room for them, and there will be a sitter that will stay with the person 24 hours a day. In some instances, the person will be allowed to stay at home with family members or friends while they're in custody. One exception is that some adults remain in the hospital on a social hold until placement is found. Some of our adults can be difficult to place, nowhere for them to go. Hospital might keep them there on a social hold. They're not medically admitted to the hospital, but they're there on a social hold getting minimal services and just basically staying at a safe place until placement can be found. Next slide. I'm now going to bring Phil back to talk a little bit about the responsibilities of the guardian ad litem.
Thank you, Brenda. Appreciate that. First thing that the guardian ad litem does when we are appointed, I'll get a call from Brenda down at the Department of Aging, and she will kind of review the case with me and ask me if I want to take that case. And it'll be a case in one of the jurisdictions that I've volunteered for. Once I tell her, yes, I'll take the case, then I start by first getting appointed as a guardian ad litem. I'll get a piece of paper that's called a certificate of appointment or an order of appointment. And once I get that, then I can actually start my duties. That makes me officially a representative of the vulnerable adult. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to conduct an independent, balanced, and impartial assessment of the facts and the needs of the vulnerable adult. And it's going to be something relevant to his situation or her situation. I'm going to do that investigation primarily through interviews and reading documents. I'm going to interview family members, caregivers, medical providers, law enforcement, anybody that might have relevant information that they can give me about this person's situation and circumstances. I will attend any court proceedings that come about, any hearings. And my job at those is to report to the court, most of the time under oath, but sometimes through written reports, the results of my investigation or any findings I may have, and what I feel like is in the best interest of the vulnerable adult. And like I said, provide written reports, whatever testimony I may need to provide. If it's actually in a courtroom, I may have to go to the witness stand and be sworn in and be asked questions by the vulnerable adults attorney, by the DSS attorney, and by my own attorney for the purpose of kind of laying everything out in front of the judge at family court. I think the thing that's most important to remember about the guardian ad litem's responsibilities is that you're responsible for looking out for the best interest of the vulnerable adult. That may or may not coincide with what the vulnerable adult themselves want. They have an attorney that represents that interest for them. It may or may not coincide with what the family wants. While I interview the family, and I'm certainly aware of what the family's desires and wishes are, ultimately my legal responsibility is to the vulnerable adult to find what is in their best interest and to advocate for that in front of the court, the family court. And that gives the guardian ad litem's position quite a bit of weight in the family court. The judges are going to tend to put a lot of emphasis on what the guardian ad litem says. And for that reason, you have to be very particular that you've done the investigation and that you're presenting the facts and stuff accurately so that the judge is getting a true picture of what you think is in the best interest. And those are the responsibilities and kind of how it plays out. Sometimes you have to go to court and sometimes you don't. Some counties are very good about doing what we do in Lexington County. We generally have a decision amongst all of the attorneys and the DSS and the families and everything as to what's going to happen. And we kind of go and present that to the judge and everybody's in agreement and we can generally not have to go through court. Some jurisdictions, the judges want you in court under oath all the time. And everything that's done is done that way. It just depends.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. That's a great explanation of the role of the guardian ad litem. Okay, next slide. So what happens at court? Like Phil said, sometimes you don't go to court. Sometimes you have a consent order. That's especially in Lexington County. But in a lot of other counties, we do actually have to go to the courthouse. Not during COVID, but in other times we do have to go to the courthouse. And then within 40 days after the complaint is filed, so within 40 days after that legal case begins, a merits hearing is held to determine the merits of the case. At that hearing, Department of Social Services will present their position and what they feel is best for the adult. The vulnerable adult's attorney will be there to represent what the adult wants. Again, if your neighbor, if they want to go home, even if it doesn't make sense, they represent that your neighbor should go home. The guardian ad litem is present with one of our contract attorneys. We have attorneys that we contract with across the state, and the guardian ad litem's attorney during court will present the guardian ad litem's report and recommendations. If possible, the vulnerable adult will also attend the merits hearing. We're talking about them. It's their life. We try to get them there if we can. At the hearing, or right at the end of the hearing, the judge will issue an order. At that time, the case can close and the adult be released from custody. Maybe the adult's not vulnerable anymore. They're in a safe place. Everything is done. Case can be closed. Adult's released from custody. Guardian ad litem is relieved and your job is done. Another thing that can happen is that the hearing can be continued. An example of this would be, let's say we don't have an agreement. For that initial merits hearing, they're only scheduling usually 15 minutes on the court docket. So you got 15 minutes of time. If we don't have an agreement, we know it's going to be contested. We might have to call witnesses. It'll be a trial. 15 minutes isn't going to cut it. So the judge may just choose to continue the hearing or reschedule it for a later date when more time can be set aside on the docket. Another thing that can happen at that merits hearing is that the adult might remain in custody, and that's the most common. The adult will remain in custody and will enter what we call a monitoring period. During the monitoring period, the guardian ad litem and Department of Social Services will check in with that adult at least once a month. And typically, we're also looking at some other options for the adult, maybe finding another placement for them or working with family to see if we can get the adult home. When you are in that monitoring period, you will go back to court at least every 3 to 6 months. Next slide. Who do we serve? So 75% of the adults that we serve are age 60 or older. But 25% of the adults we serve are between the ages of 18 and 59. Next slide. What kind of cases do we have? So most of our cases are actually self-neglect. So 54% of our cases, self-neglect is the primary issue. For 32%, it's neglect by a caregiver. Abuse is the primary issue in 8% of our cases, and that can include physical, psychological, or sexual abuse. For 6% of our cases, that they involve exploitation. So financial exploitation, usually that's the primary issue for those cases. Next slide. Final placement, closed cases. So where do our adults end up when the case is closed? As you can imagine, most people want to go home. So whenever we can, we try to get people home. And in fact, 30% of the time, the adult is able to return home. That could be home alone, home with a caregiver, home with a family member, home with friends, etc. Usually when they go back home, there's some extra services in place. So DSS and the Guardian Ad Litem have arranged for some extra services to be put in place so that they can be safe at home and don't have to be taken into custody again. 25% of our adults are going to ending up being placed at residential care facilities. Again, those are the assisted living facilities. 23% are at skilled nursing facilities. 10% of our adults, unfortunately, pass away before the case is closed. 2% of our adults are placed at a community training home or other Department of Disabilities and Special Needs facility. About 1% end up in psychiatric hospitals, and then 9% have other outcomes. And other outcomes can be things like jail. Sometimes we have cases where adults not considered vulnerable anymore. They've committed a crime, so they end up in jail. Sometimes there's treatment centers in other states that we don't have here in South Carolina. So those are just some examples of what are classified under the other category. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to bring Phil back in here. We're going to go over a couple of case studies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the background of the cases. So this is the information you get when you get the case. So you get an initial bit of information when you get the case. And then Phil's going to talk about, like, you know, if he got this case, what would he do? What would his steps be? And then I'll tell you what actually happened. These are actual cases. Of course, we've changed all the identifying information to protect the adult. So our first case study is Joe. Joe is 72 years old. He had a stroke that left him with right side paralysis and aphasia. He was ambulatory with a walker, and he had limited financial resources. Next slide. How did Adult Protective Services get involved? So law enforcement responded to Joe's home after receiving a report of a domestic disturbance. There were allegations that Joe was threatening his daughter and his daughter's boyfriend. Joe was unable to verbally communicate to law enforcement, and law enforcement placed Joe into emergency protective custody. Next slide. So if this was your case and you got that information, who would you want to interview?
Well, in this particular case, I would, well, let me back up and say, generally my philosophy on the interviews is I try to get as much information as possible prior to interviewing the vulnerable adult. In this case, I would want to interview the daughter and the boyfriend and find out what prompted the domestic disturbance call, you know, what was going on there. And I would want to talk, if possible, to some of the neighbors to find out what is the frequency of this. Is this something that's happened frequently, that police have had to react to this domestic disturbance? I'd also want to talk to the officers that were there that took the vulnerable adult into custody and make sure that I had any other information that they could give me about how often they've had to respond, or what was the situation, what was their read on the situation when they got there. I'd probably also want to look and see if there were any other family members that I could talk to that would be familiar with the situation. Maybe, you know, a brother or sister of the vulnerable adult, or even another friend, anybody that could give me a third-party perspective from as to what was going on with the adult. And those would be the people I'd look at first. And then, of course, you want to interview the vulnerable adult. And that would be the next, after I've interviewed these, that would be my next stop, would be them.
All right. Good. Thanks, Phil. What are some obstacles you think you might face in this case?
In this case, when you have a domestic situation like this, you're always, I think you're going to be much more prone to see it's a he said, she said, or they said, I said, or everybody has a different take on it. So it's going to be important to get as many different perspectives as possible. The other obstacle would be, I'd be concerned because it seems that the vulnerable adult, Joe, is not able to communicate verbally. So you may have some challenges there in trying to get him to communicate to you what his wishes are and what brought this situation about.
Yeah. And what do you think might be some options, just kind of initially, what do you think might be some options for Joe?
Well, obviously, if depending on what caused the domestic disturbance, he might be able to return to his home. If this is the first time and you can do something to resolve whatever issue that was, he might could return to his home. Another was there might be another family member that he could go live with instead of where he currently is. And obviously, if that's not the case, if neither of those work out, it's possible a residential facility that could meet whatever level of care he would need there. And that would depend some on his financial situation and obviously what type of care he would need.
Right. Those are all great ideas. Thanks, Phil. Now I'm going to talk to you about what actually did happen. So the first thing was that the guardian ad litem looked at some of the medical records and saw that the psychiatrist at the emergency department recorded Joe could not effectively communicate his wishes. Therefore, he is unable to make his own decisions. Secondly, Adult Protective Services made recommendations to family court based on the observation by the emergency department psychiatrist. So actually, based on those recommendations, Department of Social Services was going to recommend that Joe be placed in a facility, at least temporarily. The third thing is obviously communication with Joe was very limited. Next slide. One of the things I like this example because it really shows the difference a guardian ad litem can make, especially our volunteers, because they can spend a lot of time with adult, really get to know him. So this guardian went to see Joe numerous times in the hospital. And when she communicated with Joe, she felt like he was trying to tell her more than what was coming out, and more than that he understood more than what the psychiatrist was letting on to. So she talked to us and she said, well, what can I do? And we just said, whatever, you try to come up with something. So she went on the computer and found this, what they call an alphabet board, printed it out and brought this with her just when she went to see Joe. And what she found out was that Joe could communicate using this alphabet board. He could communicate just fine. And he was able to provide her with lots of information. Perhaps the most important being that Joe had a sister that he wanted to live with. Next slide. So the communication barrier was broken. The GAL was able to speak with Joe. Joe was able to share his truth. Other family members confirmed his stories. And Joe was released from Adult Protective Services custody to live with his sister. Our next case study is Elaine. Elaine it's a different kind of case. Elaine is 84 years old. Her diagnoses included anxiety disorder, osteoarthritis, venous insufficiency, chronic knee, and back pain. Elaine lived in her home for over 50 years. She was a single mom who raised 3 children alone. She took care of herself, drove herself to the doctor, did her own cooking and shopping. But Elaine reported that she had lost interest in taking care of her home after one of her children died in 2006. After that time, Elaine refused to let her children or other visitors into her home. Next slide. So how did Adult Protective Services get involved? In this case, Elaine fell in her home and she called the EMS herself. When the EMS arrived, they found that the trash in the home prevented a clear pathway through the home. EMS felt like the conditions of the home compromised Elaine's safety. They called law enforcement. Law enforcement placed Elaine into emergency protective custody. After a medical evaluation, Elaine was placed at an assisted living facility. This is a picture of Elaine's house. It's not actually Elaine's house. I just grabbed this off the internet, but it's just to give you an idea. I was, Hoarder's house, and Elaine's house had quite a bit more stuff in this. You can see there was a little pathway here, and apparently there was a pathway that Elaine could get through, but she said that when the EMS workers came, she's like, they were big guys. They couldn't get through, but I could get through just fine. But but that was their issue. And this is what the situation we were facing. Phil, in this case, if you got this case, who would you want to interview?
I think this one is a little bit differently, but is a little bit different. I would want to interview the neighbors and see what they knew about the situation. Had the vulnerable adult been able to come and go and that type of thing, take care of themselves. I would also want to look at her medical records and the evaluation the doctors did when she was placed into emergency protective custody to see just what their take on what she's capable of doing. Is this something that the neglect has happened because of something like depression or lack of motivation, or is this something that she physically can't do? I would want to talk to those. I'd also want to interview the family members and see if I could get a better understanding as to why they weren't allowed around the house. Is there something that can be fixed there where they could check on her or not? That would be the main three that I'd want to interview.
Right. And what are some obstacles you think you might face?
With the family, if they've not been allowed to be around, they may not be aware of just what the situation is. They may not be able to give you a lot of information other than, oh, mom said I can't come by. So you don't know whether you're getting any information out of that. Depending on the type of neighborhood that she lives in, how close the neighbors are, you may or may not get good information from them. So you may be relying totally on what Elaine tells you and what you can get from law enforcement or from the medical staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what are some possible options for Elaine?
Well, if the medical staff tells you that she could take care of herself, there's no reason why she can't. Then I think the approach to the problem has to be, okay, how do we fix the situation in the home where she can stay there? Because generally speaking, it's going to be in the vulnerable adult's best interest to be able to stay in a familiar environment, the least restrictive place for them. And so I'd want to look at that as an option first. If the medical people felt like, well, she can't be released back to the home by herself, then look and see if we can make some kind of arrangements where either neighbors or maybe she could be convinced to allow her family to come by and check on her periodically, so that it could be a collaborative effort keeping the house in condition that she can stay there. If that doesn't work out, if the family members are not close enough or are unwilling to do that, or neighbors don't want to take that responsibility on, then you might have to look at the only other option, which would be some type of an assisted living facility, depending on what her needs were physically.
Right. Those are all great thoughts, Phil. Thank you. So here's what happened when the guardian ad litem actually did their assessment. They found out that Elaine said she liked the facility they placed her in. She liked that assisted living facility, but she wanted the choice. She was confident and she wanted the choice to be able to stay at the facility or return home. Elaine could not return home. DSS would not be in agreement for Elaine to return home until it was cleaned and the risk of self-neglect was reduced. Elaine, unfortunately, could not physically clean the home herself. Next slide. So Elaine, the outcome of this case was that Elaine did allow her children to clean the home. She finally let them in. She let them clean the house. She agreed to monthly visits from friends and family if she was permitted to go home. And after the home was cleaned, Elaine was released from custody. She returned home. Guardian ad litem was relieved, and the case was closed. Okay, next slide. Just want to talk briefly about how COVID-19 is impacting our cases. One of the things, as you can imagine, we have more pressure to get people home, if possible, as quickly as we can. We now have 37 of our adults have tested positive for COVID-19. Many of them have gotten better. 7 of those have died while testing positive. That's about 10% of our cases. That 37 is about 10% of our cases. So if someone comes into custody, if we can get them home, we try to get them home, because the people are contracting these cases in facilities. Unfortunately, that's getting better, but that's where they've been getting it. So if there's any way to get people home, we work with DSS to try to get them home as quickly as we can. Most of our visits are now being conducted virtually. Visits are being done by phone, FaceTime, and Google Duo. Our court hearings are routinely taking place via WebEx. If the case is an agreement, we try to resolve the case by consent order so we don't have to have a court hearing. Only a few of our volunteers are currently taking new cases. And right now we're not training new volunteers. We're accepting applications for volunteers because as soon as we can, we want to get everyone trained. So we're accepting applications, but we haven't conducted a training yet during COVID. And then our caseload is down a bit. So that is a concern because we don't know if adults are getting missed. So our caseload's down. We don't know if adults are out there. If they're being abused, neglected, or exploited, we're not getting those cases. That's certainly a concern of ours. Next slide. Now I'm going to switch over to Phil for the rest of the presentation and let him talk to you about volunteering with the VAGAL program.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. First off, the volunteer, this is a statewide program. While I am here in Columbia, when you decide that you want to be a volunteer, you can do that anywhere in the state. They will ask you where you want to take cases. I currently take cases for Lexington County, Richland County, Newberry County, and Aiken County. It was my choice to take those, and I could have taken either just one of them or any other combination of them. But I have family in those places, so it makes it convenient for me to volunteer in those areas. But you can volunteer anywhere in the state. They have the state broken up into districts, and each area works with a different kind of supervisor, for lack of a better term. Here in the Midlands, Shell Kazimko is my immediate report to here. She handles this Midlands area. As far as a background or what would prepare you for this type of volunteer work, you could literally have any kind of background. I think if I were looking at skill set, somebody that's got some organization skills and some ability to organize thoughts and that type of thing, because you are going to make written reports and you are going to be possibly testifying in court about those reports. And so the ability to organize and to write that is good. You need some rudimentary computer skills. You need to be able to effectively use email and maybe Microsoft Word, some type of word processing software so you can write your reports, and you'll be communicating a lot via email. Also, with the pandemic, we've had to learn to do a lot over the computer through WebEx and Zoom and that type of stuff. We weren't allowed into the facility, so if you interviewed a client or vulnerable adult, you're going to have to do it over Skype or FaceTime or some type of software like that. They need volunteers everywhere. I don't know that as long as you qualify, I can't imagine they would turn down a volunteer anywhere in the state. Next slide. The requirements, pretty simple. Must be 21 years of age, must have access to a computer or tablet and some minimal computer skills, which I just talked about, and a passion for advocating for vulnerable adults. I frequently get asked at people who knew me before I volunteered for this, and they found out when I volunteered, they would ask me later and say, well, are you having fun doing that? And I would tell them, no, it's not fun. It's very rewarding, but it's not what I would call fun. If you have a passion for advocating for vulnerable adults or people who need someone to speak up for them, it's extremely rewarding, especially when you encounter cases like we saw with Joe, where you're able to change the outcome as the guardian ad litem because of your investigation and your ability to help that vulnerable adult. I've had an opportunity to be involved in a couple of cases like that. One when I was observing and one that I've got now. And it is extremely rewarding. But you're frequently, you're interviewing people that are not in the best of circumstances. So it's not what I would call fun. Next slide, Dina. All of the volunteers, if you decide that you want to volunteer, you contact Brenda. They'll run a background check. When they start doing training classes again, you'll attend a training class, and it's basically an all-day training class. You go from like 9 to 3. Excellent training, absolutely top drawer. And after you finish that training, you will be required to shadow at least 2 cases with hearings in court. Because Lexington County was one of my districts or one of my jurisdictions, I ended up going to Aiken to be able to shadow the cases, because it's pretty rare that they go to court in Lexington. Most everything gets decided outside of court. And you'll go in and you'll see the entire process before the judge. And in fact, the person who signs off on your paper that you shadowed the case is the judge. So you have to be there and you have to pay attention and you have to see what's going on. And you'll do 2 of those. And then again, you'll work closely with a regional coordinator, mine being Shell, and they are an invaluable asset. I'm on the phone probably more than Shell wants me to be to her, but she always answers my questions and is a great resource. There's literally nothing you're going to encounter that they can't help you with if you'll pick up the phone and call either your regional coordinator, or if you needed to talk to Brenda, I would imagine you could call her as well. And you're not going to ever hurt for help or assistance, whatever you need in order to get your vulnerable adults taken care of. Next slide. What it's like to be a VAGAL South Carolina volunteer. As I said, it's very rewarding. It works well with a lot of retired people like myself for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think we are unique in our outlook because we are also older adults. And as you saw on the slide, 60–70% of the people that we work with are over 60. So we know what kind of challenges they face in a lot of cases. So that's a big plus for us. The other thing that I would say what it's like to be a volunteer is that you can kind of set your own workload. When Brenda or Shell call me about a case, I can tell them that, well, right now I've got some medical things going on. I'm going to be taking a lot of doctor's visits. I'd rather not take on a case right now. And that's fine. They will find somebody else. So you can control the number of cases you have that way. They won't overload you with cases. And you don't really ever feel like you're pressured to take a case because, well, somebody's got to take it. So I think it's an ideal volunteer opportunity in that regard. You can control, if you live in Lexington, like I live literally only a few blocks from the courthouse. So it's very easy for me to get down to the courthouse at Lexington to meet with attorneys and that type of stuff. The training is top drawer, like I said. The communications from them at Department on Aging is excellent. So being a volunteer it fits well with the retired lifestyle, for lack of a better term, and it's very rewarding. I don't regret for a minute the time that I have spent doing it. I intend to continue to do it as long as I can. And it's been great. It certainly has given me a perspective that I did not have before. It's kind of one of those things that you know there's got to be people out there that are in these situations. But until you actually encounter them and you have to interview the people and deal one-on-one with the people involved, you don't truly understand. And I have people here at United Way have known me for years have known that I have always been a person that has said from the beginning that if you want a position at the table, the way to get a position at the table is to contribute financially and to volunteer so that you understand the issues. When you do both of those, now you've got some serious skin in the game, so to speak. And that gives you an opportunity to start to affect policy and to really be helpful in the longer term for these people. And this is an ideal place to gain that experience, is you will see a side of society that you might not encounter otherwise. And for us that are aging, in a lot of cases, these things hit close to home. A lot of us have relatives that are in these same situations. And the experience that I've gained doing this will benefit me down the road. And I would encourage you, if you think that you have an opportunity, the time to do it, I'd encourage you to contact Brenda. It's a very worthwhile experience, and I'm not sorry for a minute that I have done it, and I will continue to do it. I know that Brenda and I are both will be more than happy to answer any questions you have. I'll let Adina or Claudia tell you how to get those questions in, and be glad to answer anything we can. Thank you.
Thank both of you. And we do have a few questions. I'm going to pop them on the screen. I think some of them you may have answered, but you may have some more information that you could hand to give them. And here's one. How many people are 18 plus in the custody of the social services?
Right.
And 65 plus. I think you mentioned that.
Well, as far as our cases, about 75% are 60 and older, and 25% are between the ages of 18 and 59. We have about 400 open cases total. We could do, so I say 100 and 300 is probably how it's going to play out. The South Carolina Department of Social Services, their numbers might look a little different. We don't close the cases until we get that final court order. Sometimes we get delayed on getting that order, so their numbers might be a little bit different, but that's what we have. So about 100 under 60 and 300 60 and over.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yes. And actually, Melanie Dalton sent us several questions. I'm going to kind of show them in order here. I feel you just went over some qualifications. And Brenda, is there anything you might want to add to that?
Really, like Phil said, I mean, the main thing is that you care. Passion, that's the main thing. We can build on it from there. You know, other than a few basic things like the computers, you having a computer, you do need to have that, and being 21. We can work with that. We can work with everything else. Just passion. Really, you have to care.
Passion. And also, how are folks protected when they're participating in the guardian ad litem program?
Yes, so there are some liability protections if you're working in the adults. As long as you're working in the adult's best interest, you have some liability protections. Now, as far as your own, we do expect volunteers to have like car insurance. So if they go out and they, God forbid, get in the car accident while they're volunteering, we would expect them to be covered that under their own insurance. But there are some protections against, let's say, a family member suing you or something like that. There are protections there.
Okay. I know you mentioned that you're taking applications, but you are not doing any training right now. Can you talk a little more about how training would take place when you're able to do that again? And what, is it a short time, long time? How detailed is that?
Before we start doing conducting trainings again? Is that I'm sorry?
When you conduct trainings, what kind of how does training work?
Okay, yeah, Phil, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, be glad to. When I went through my training, we, of course, came down to the Department of Aging there at 1300 Gervais Street. We were in a classroom situation all day, and it's presentations by various people, various things. You'll see some of the legal aspects. You'll go through cases. You'll talk about things that you need to take into consideration when you're interviewing people, how the interview process itself works. Just a general good training. I mean, I walked away from the training not feeling like there was anything that I could think of at the time that had been missed or, I wish we'd have spent more time on that. It was very good, but it's centralized. And then you'll do your two shadow court appearances, and those can be done. Sometimes it happens quickly. It took me a little while to get mine in because as we got them scheduled a couple of times, and then all of a sudden there was an agreement and there was no court, so I couldn't go see any testimony. But I was finally able to get my two in on the same day. But it took me a couple of months to get those two in. And before you can actually be, if I'm not mistaken, Brenda, I think before you can actually be a guardian ad litem, you have to have gotten those two signed off, right?
Right. And Phil's right. That has been kind of the trickiest part, is getting in there to shadow those hearings, because sometimes you go to court to shadow and then it's resolved by consent or the case is continued and you can't shadow that day. We're hoping to kind of allow more opportunities for volunteers to shadow maybe a children's case if the adult cases don't work out, just to keep that process moving along, and so you can see what goes on in court.
And a question for Melanie, how, once a case is accepted, about how much time is needed to bring it to conclusion?
In general, I would say on average, okay, maybe if average, I would say maybe 6 to 8 months per case. But some of our cases last a couple of years. Some of our cases will close right at that merits hearing, so that's 40 days. But on average, I would say, maybe 8 months. What do you think, Phil?
I was going to say I have had one case that was closed in 2 days because the person passed away. I literally never even interviewed them. And I have got one case that is going on a year old. And so you can be anywhere in between. But you will have some that go before the hearing. I think I've had 2 cases that I've had the person deceased before we could actually get a hearing. And that's a case where somebody maybe it's a medical condition that is deteriorating pretty rapidly, and sometimes they don't survive long enough to go to a hearing.
Right. And one thing to keep in mind is if a case does go long, if something comes up in your life, if you have to move or your situation changes, we can ask to have the guardian ad litem changed. We don't like to do that too often, but that's an option. So if anyone's concerned that maybe I won't be able to stay on it for the 2 years, then that we do have that option.
Well, you've really given us a lot of information. Actually, Debbie sent a message while you were telling the very first story. And it was a great story when you can get people and help them stay in their homes and get the help. And I know, Phil, you've shared some stories with us about just staying in there and being determined to help someone and actually have some really nice success stories. So we know that you're out there helping people, and thank you very much. And I know our time is getting short. That looks like you can let people know how to get involved, and then Liz, want to join us? Okay.
Liz. Okay. Yeah. I thought Brenda and Phil did a great job. And you, of course, Claudia, you always do a great job. But that was very inspiring. And I hope some of the people listening will take the opportunity to, fill out an application and maybe once things get more back to normal, they'll start training again. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I want to especially thank the AARP Driver Safety for being our sponsor. And I hope that you will, if you're not already a member of Always United, please consider joining. There really aren't any obligations, but it gives you a chance. We like to think we do more for you than you do for us, maybe, because we give you opportunities to go out and to volunteer, and that'll make you feel terrific.
And Adina, would you put up our slide about, we've got some great programs coming up. Well, here, let's see, we've got Walter Edgar on the 20th, and these again, it will be at noon on Tuesday, October the 20th. He's going to talk about It Wasn't in the Plan. That's his life plan. And on November 10th, we'll have Debbie Howard talk about the caregiver journey, what you need to know to help others, and why you need to plan your own future care. And it's exciting to have both of these programs. Candy Waits, who's a very active member with United Way, is a friend of Walter's, and she was able to get him. And I think this would be a good one to listen to, because many of our lives have not taken the direction we thought they would. And Walter certainly he has done a lot of wonderful things. You see him on NPR, and you hear about the stories of South Carolina. But this is going to be the story about Walter's plan that he had and the path and journey that he's ended up taking. And he'll love to answer questions on that storytelling that he's able to do. And then John David Spade helped us connect with Debbie Howard. She has worked internationally and found she had all of a sudden had to come home and take care of her mother. And she's really put a lot of resources together, and then found out and realized that we all need to make that plan ahead of time. So we know who we want to take care of us and how we can make those tough decisions in life. So I think we've got two real fun programs headed your way. And
So
Adina,
everybody watch the Always United website down at theunitedway.org and plan on joining us for those. If you have any further questions on this presentation, please let us know. There's Adina, our boss.
I don't know if I would consider myself y'all's boss, but I am the director of Always Not United. And yeah, it's just such a great group of really excited typically late career to retiree age group. And it's just been so great because we've had opportunities and working on opportunities to volunteer and to give back to so many different areas of our community, and then also to just build in like community activities like our Tuesday talks and everything. And so if you are interested, an easy way to do to start the steps in being part of Always United is to either like Liz said, go to alwaysunited.org, or you can email me. I'll be the one answering if you email alwaysunited@ua.org. But I'll make sure to send all that information so you are ready to go and up to date and can learn about our Tuesday talks and so many different opportunities we have. Well,
Goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.